So, welcome back to the second part. And without further ado, I'm just going to hand over back to Johannes. Enjoy the show. And afterwards, we're going to do some practical things.
Yes, many thanks to all of you for your patience listening to that long. I just reconsidered due to the time plans we have how we can do it further, and now I'll present a bit more specific on the issue of climate change, and then afterwards we'll have a longer practical scenario where we can work together in groups on this scenario. But first of all, let's look at some basic issues regarding the maybe most pressing problem within the whole area of environmental ethics and sustainability issues, namely the case of climate change. I think we are all extremely familiar with the problem and the moral dimensions of the problem as well. But simply to somehow summarize a couple of main aspects. Within the climate ethics, we always try to say it's when we want to have climate system protection is not because the climate system is in need of protection, but because other things we value, namely, for example, ourselves, are in need of protection. So climate system protection is mainly the protection of human lives, of human rights, and of the environment, of other living beings in the environment as well. So I think this is always an important thing to keep in mind, although it's in a way obvious to all of us. And the climate crisis produces changes in the system that have a lot of morally bad outcomes and consequences. I here mentioned on the slide simply a couple of them. You're all familiar with them. An increasing probability of natural disasters with serious consequences for human beings as one important outcome, an increase of disasters like droughts, crop failures, and the world problem of famine, which still is far beyond our control. The scarcity of water, the increasing scarcity of water, which might produce new violent conflicts between nations and states, and we see some of these conflicts already, and political instability, for example, due to failed states or state failure that is somehow increasing by climate change, or due to the many displaced persons who, for example, are not longer able to live traditional ways of living due to changes in the climate system. So we have a huge, big bundle of problems that is associated with the climate crisis. And if we're talking about these problematic outcomes, we're already talking about specific groups that might be specifically vulnerable to the problems of climate change. And in the context of climate change, we are most often talking about three very broad groups of high or especially high vulnerability in the scenario of climate change. Namely, first of all, many people in the global south, the vast majority of the people living in the global south, due to reasons of poverty, but as well poor people in the global north, likewise due to reasons of poverty, because, for example, poor people in the global north are typically those people who face the highest climate change related risks. And as a third group, future generations, all these generations of human beings that are yet to come. If you look at them, these groups, then you easily recognize one problem that makes climate crisis even a more serious issue from the moral point of view. Namely, if you contribute a lot to climate change, if your emissions are extremely high, you most probably belong to a group less affected by climate change's consequences. So typically, the highest contribution to climate changes are made by rich people from the global north, and at the same time, rich people from the global north are those people that are less affected by climate change, although we are all affected by climate change. So we have here an important and morally extremely problematic disproportionality between those people who are contributing a lot to causing the problem and those people who are mainly affected by the problem. It might sound to be very easy to understand these three groups of vulnerable people. However, if you somehow dive deeper into the matter and really think about how exactly are they how exactly has climate change an impact on them? How are they affected by the whole thing? Then you get to some conceptual problems quite soon. And I will mention only one example of these conceptual problems to give you an idea of what we are discussing in climate ethics, and as well somehow to present that we as philosophers always like very fancy problems, problems that are in a way self-created but fascinating. And one of the such a problem I have here for you, namely the issue of future generations. If we look at this very general, it seems to be absolutely clear. Well, climate change is affecting future people, and in bad ways. They have less chances to see intact environments. They are living in a heated world, and so on and so on. So it's obviously bad for them. But then you can ask a couple of problematic questions. The first of all, I've put here, following philosopher Jane Nafson, why should I do anything for posterity? What has posterity ever done for me? I like this phrase a lot because it makes some point very clear, namely, why exactly are we responsible for the living conditions of later people? What's our relation to these people? They live in a time where we won't longer exist, so why do we have any duties towards them? And these things get even complicated, more complicated if you look at it in more formal ways. And I have only a couple of examples here, and I will maybe focus on the last one as this makes the problem most clear, namely the question, if we say climate change hurts future people are vulnerable to climate change, we should not infringe on future people's rights. What do we mean by it, after all? We understand the sentences, but in a way it's utterly unclear because these persons don't exist yet. And in which sense do persons that will only exist in the future possess rights? What do we mean to say if something has a right that does not exist yet? So this is really a tricky problem here. You can, of course, say it's rather a conceptual problem, but I think after all it's a very interesting question to think about it because this leads to the big question that is at stake here, namely, how is our relationship between those people that will live in 100 or 200 years? You can go even a bit further. I will only mention this as an example, and I won't get deep into it because I have to look at the time a bit. So you can even push this point a bit farther, and then you derive at a problem that has gained a lot of attraction in philosophical ethics, and it's called the non-identity problem. So this problem was brought up by Derek Parfit, a highly influential British philosopher, maybe one of the most important philosophers of our time. And in his book, Reasons and Persons, 40 years ago, he has a very simple starting idea. If any particular person had not been conceived when he was in fact conceived, it is in fact true that he would never have existed. So, what is here the basic idea? Our personal identity as a person does very much depend on the conception, the moment of conception, the beginning of our life, so to say, with all this fittingness that derives from this very moment. And then Parfit goes on to say, well, we can imagine two different worlds. We can imagine a world in climate crisis as we experience it right now, and we can imagine a different world, a world that solves the crisis. And these two worlds surely are highly different. The world with climate crisis has different kinds of people on it that lead different lives and that possess different identities. Why is this the case? Well, in a world in climate crisis, we are doing many everyday things quite differently than in a world that solves the crisis, where we don't have any climate crisis any longer. We are mobile in different ways, we eat in different ways, our whole everyday life is changing, and this has a consequence, namely that different people get to know different people, that different people will marry different people, get children with them, and so in the end we have very different people in the world of climate crisis and in the world where no climate crisis exists. And then if this is the case, how could a future person claim to be wrong because of climate change? And Parfit somehow insinuates to say, well, they could not be wronged at all, because in a world where there won't be any climate change, they as a person won't never exist. Because the world runs so differently that there is no way that a person exists in both worlds. As I said, I just mentioned this as somehow pointing out to the kind of conceptual problems that philosophy always tries to deal with as well. And I personally think it's a very fascinating, fancy problem to think about this non-identity problem and why, after all, we really hurt future generations through climate change. But this only as a kind of somehow looking into philosophy. Now let's somehow stay with the hard issue that is at stake here. We just saw on the previous slide, those groups of people that are most vulnerable to climate change are most often those people that did not contribute a lot or even nothing to the problem. So we have a high injustice here. And so one important question, maybe the most important question of climate ethics after all, is the question of climate justice. So the question, who is responsible, up to which degree, to fight climate change, to pay for the damages caused by climate change, but as well, of course, to pay all the things we have to do for adaptation and mitigation. So the issue, who's responsible, who has to pay. And on this slide and on the next slide, I simply noted the basic idea of 3 different approaches to answer this central and crucial question of climate justice. And you will see very quickly that these approaches differ in important ways and lead to entirely different conceptions of climate justice. So the first conception we call in philosophy egalitarianism, and what we have here is the idea of equity, of people being equal. And here the main idea is to say future generations must be at least as well off as we are. So what we have to do is to make sure that future people do have at least the same as we have right now. And we have many areas of justice where equality is an important standard for just politics, to say that people are entitled to get the same things. Just think, for example, of a public health system where we have a catalog of measurements that are paid for everyone who is a member in the system. So we have a lot of ideas of equality and justice. If we, however, start to think about this idea of egalitarianism a bit further, we soon realize first problems in the idea. For example, who is the we are talking about? It obviously makes a big it obviously makes a big difference whether the we is a rich person or a group of rich persons in the global north, or whether the we is a group of poor persons in the global south who have problems to plan for the next year of how they can manage their survival. This obviously makes a huge difference, and many implicitly seems to assume that the we is somehow a well-off living standard from the global north, but it is not clear that this is the case, and we really have to think, if we are egalitarianists, about this question. What is somehow the level of equality that is our point of departure? Besides this conceptual problem, we can ask the question of why should egalitarianism be an attractive ideal? Why should we become egalitarianists in climate justice? And one example, one idea that is very present in the discourse and that is often mentioned is to say that there is something like an intergenerational chain. And so here is the basic idea. We, for example, here in Germany are quite well off compared to other times and compared to other countries. We received a lot of benefits from the past, from the previous generation. And we are extremely profiting from these benefits. And this somehow generates a moral duty to pass on from our side as well some benefits towards the future. So you have the idea of an intergenerational chain. Each generation receives something from previous generations and in exchange gives something to further generations or future generations. This could be one strategy to say, how can we defend egalitarianism and say that this is a very good concept of climate justice. A second approach is an approach I've already mentioned twice in the first part of this talk, namely utilitarianism. Here the basic idea is we should maximize utility. Utility, I mentioned it before in the beginning, is often understood as pleasure and pain or desire fulfillment. So we should maximize the pleasure of all people that will ever live on the world in all different times or places. Or we should maximize the fulfillment of desires of these people. So this could be, of course, a leading understanding of climate justice. And then the question is, what would we need to do to meet this standard, to somehow realize utilitarianist climate justice? And those utilitarianism that are working in climate change ethics are often quite explicit and say, well, if we look at all prognosis we have regarding the development of populations, the claim seems to be true that the best is yet to come. Most human beings that will ever live in the future on our Earth will live in the future because we have only 200 years now where populations are increasing very quickly, and we will have thousands of years to come with a lot of people living on Earth, far more people than lived on Earth in the last centuries or live on Earth currently. If this is true, and if the best is yet to come, then probably we are well advised to be very to give as much as we can towards the future, to leave as much as we can to the future, because the future might be better in fulfilling desires and creating pleasure. They will have the better technologies as well. There are more people. So a utilitarian climate ethics often comes to the conclusion that we really now have to radically cut our emissions to maybe even lower and degrade our standard of living to realize or to make sure that future generations can maximize utility, can maximize pleasure or desire fulfillment. So if you compare this to egalitarianism, there certainly has a lot more things to be done for realizing climate justice. And there is a third approach. There are, of course, many other approaches, but somehow given the basic approaches. And the third approach is called sufficientarianism. Sufficientarianism, first of all, sounds like a very complicated word, but if you think of the adjective sufficient, you grasp the basic idea very quickly. Climate justice, according to sufficientarianism, consists in making sure that future people should have enough, that they should be sufficiently well off. And then, of course, the question is, what is enough? What is meant by enough? And then many people in the field say, well, a very good standard for enough is the basic standard of human rights. So future generations will have enough if they have the means they need for realizing human rights for everyone. Civic rights, political rights, social rights, and as well environmental rights. So you see, enough can be a quite complicated, a quite tough standard if we take the whole bundle of human rights into account. And then once again, we get the problem that I've mentioned earlier, namely, for example, given that we still have many places of the world where even basic human rights are not secured and are endangered and violated every day, is it really plausible to expect, for example, from poor countries that are unable to guarantee social rights, social human rights for those people who live there already? Is it really plausible to say these states have a duty to fight climate change and to ensure human rights of future people? So obviously there seems to be a gap here and a very problematic conflict between protecting and realizing, first of all, realizing the social human rights of contemporary people and securing the human rights of future generations. So, as this quick overview makes clear, there are very different concepts to understand climate justice, and depending on the concept you choose, the duties you have in realizing climate justice will be very different and very differently demanding. Okay, based on this whole issue, we can somehow turn to the second central question that I mentioned at the beginning of the second part of our afternoon here, namely the question, who is responsible? after all, how should responsibility be divided between the different states? Which state is up to which degree responsible for fighting climate change, for paying the cost for adaptation or mitigation? And here are two principles on the slide that are often mentioned in the debate as somehow basic principles of describing moral responsibility in facing the climate crisis. The first idea, and we are very familiar with it, is the principle of causation. So if you play football and if you shoot the football into the window of a neighbor and the football crashes the window or some beautiful glasses that stood on the table inside the living room whatsoever, then you are responsible for the damage you've caused because you caused it. So there's a causal chain from your action and the damage, and therefore you are the one who has to pay. So this is maybe the most prominent principle of climate-related responsibility, to say a state is responsible for protecting the climate, for contributing to solving the problem to the degree that this state has contributed to emissions, has produced emissions, and therefore has produced the problem. So we have a rough equalization of duties and contributions to the problem. In the second principle, the idea is another one. This principle is often called principle of capability, and here the idea is those who are responsible are, those who are able to help are the ones who are responsible and should help and must help. Think again of the example I had at the very beginning of the afternoon, namely the example of the drowning child in the lake. If you are the one who is passing by and you see the child is drowning in the lake, you are responsible to help. And you are responsible to get the child out there, and not because you have contributed anything to the problem, because it might be entirely the child's own action that brought the child into trouble. This is all fine, but nevertheless you are responsible simply because you are there and you are able to help. And so we have, of course, moral situations where we are relying on this principle of capability. First aid measurements. If there is an emergency and you are simply by chance around and you are able to aid, you are obliged to aid, and you might even be sentenced if you do not provide the aid that you could provide. So we have two very well-established principles from many other areas of morals, the principle of causation and the principle of capability. And please keep these two principles as leading principles in mind, because shortly we will make some kind of practical exercise where you exactly need these two principles. So the principle of causation and the principle of capability. Both principles produce a couple of more specific problems. I would like to mention only two of them, namely, first of all, what is often called in the debate the so-called historical responsibility. So here the question is, it's around 30 or 40 years that we know as scientific societies, scientific communities, that climate change exists and that climate change is caused by human emissions. What is with all the historic emissions that have been emitted before this knowledge was produced or this knowledge was secured in a way? So are especially the old Western countries more responsible because historically seen they have produced more emissions? Or could they say up to a certain point, well, at this point of time, our country could not know that emissions have this damaging effect, so they are out, somehow they do not count morally. This issue of historical responsibility plays an important role in political negotiations of climate change. Year by year, the problem becomes less important because the weight of historic emissions is not that important anymore. So the vast majority of emissions that we now have in the atmosphere has been produced in the last decades and not in the decades or centuries before. So the problem is shrinking over time in a certain way. The second problem is more complicated, namely the problem of how to assign specific emissions to specific states. So if different states are obliged to reduce their emissions, what exactly does count as their emissions? And there are a lot of problems. I only picked out one very important problem, namely the issue of production chains. So as you probably all know, China is nowadays the state with the greatest amount of emissions. At the same time, China is the state where a lot of industrial products for all countries in the world are produced. So, what to make with the emissions produced in these processes of building, toys, furniture, whatsoever? Should these emissions count as Chinese emissions and therefore fall under the responsibility of the Chinese government to reduce emissions, or should they partly count or even totally count as emissions belonging to, for example, first world countries that are buying the product? So there are a lot of problems in somehow assigning emissions, groups of emissions, bundles of emissions to different states, and somehow delineating the amount of responsibility between the different states. Another topic that in this context is very important. We all know that that climate science nowadays is very much advanced and is very good able to create climate models that somehow try to predict future developments and to assign probabilities to different possible outcomes, to different possible developments. So one central question, especially for politics and for policy advising, that is another important area of ethics, is to say, well, what kind of climate models should we focus on? Should we focus on those models that are most probable, those models that, according to the climate science knowledge we have, are most probable to develop, to somehow fit to reality? Or should we focus on those models that provide the most catastrophic scenarios? So should we focus on the scenario that is most probable, or should we focus on the scenario that is so catastrophic that we should try everything we can do to avoid that this scenario becomes reality? And one could frame this question into the question, should one be an optimist regarding climate change, or should one be a pessimist? An optimist ethics is looking at, well, let's see what is the scenario with the highest probability. Let's focus on the scenario and let's see how can we deal with this scenario, what kind of measurements are necessary to relying on the scenario to somehow restrict climate change up to a certain degree. The pessimist, by contrast, says, well, the whole thing is that complicated and the whole thing is that dangerous for humanity in general that we should not rely too much on probabilities of different scenarios. We should rather focus on the worst outcome and see how can we make sure, and make sure does mean 100% make sure that this scenario would never become reality and that we really can stop this scenario and really can avoid this scenario. The second option, being pessimist about such predictions, is an option that figures prominently, especially in traditional environmental ethics, and it is very tightly connected to one book and one author, namely to Johannes, a German Jewish philosopher by origin, who had his philosophical career in the United States. And already in the 1970s, he wrote a book, The Principle of Responsibility, that is considered now as an absolute classic on environmental ethics. And there he claims that in situations of great uncertainty and with high moral stakes, we should be pessimists and avoid any further risks. So, and nowadays, interpreters of Jonas would say, well, climate crisis is exactly such a situation. So we have a lot of uncertainty in our climate modelings. We have a lot of high moral stakes that are at risk here. It's, after all, the future of humanity that is at risk here in a certain sense. So we should really be pessimists. We should avoid any further risks and look on the worst outcomes. And Jonas has put this into a prominent sentences, namely in the idea that the bad prognosis has priority over the good prognosis. So morally appropriate conduct where the risks are high is always to look at the bad prognosis and then do everything that needs to be done to prevent this worst case scenario. And Hans Jonas has even coined another term for this, namely the so-called heuristics of fear. And there he says, where we have high moral stakes, where the risks are great and where we have uncertainty, we should really be guided by fear. Fear is a rational attitude in this moment. It's not something that is sometimes called as being irrational, being too emotional, etc. No, Jonas says, where the risks are really existentially, we should be guided by fear, because if we are afraid, if we are really fearing for something, we realize in a certain sense what is at stake here. We learn as well something about what we as human beings value in the world if we are afraid of losing this thing. And it is especially this idea of heuristics of fear that had something like a big renaissance in the last years. So you find, for example, iconic depictions, iconic pictures by the maybe most famous German climate activist Luisa Neubauer in certain kinds of demonstrations. Sorry, I've talked too much this afternoon. Pictures of Luisa Neubauer, where she is presenting, sitting at demonstrations, this book of Hans Jonas, The Principle of Responsibility. So in the last years, giving the climate crisis movement, Hans Jonas is very popular again, and his theses have been very influential in the whole area of climate ethics. Okay, and now, as my voice already tells me, and you probably think the same, that you already listened for a long time, and now, therefore, I really have something for some practical exercise for you, namely a little scenario that I would like to discuss with you in groups. And this scenario is formed after the US economist Jared Hardin, who coined a very important concept, namely the concept of the tragedy of the commons. What are the commons? The common land. The common land is an institution we find in the Middle Ages and the early modern period in many European countries. It's a common grassland of a village that all villagers are entitled to graze their sheep upon. So there is a meadow that does not belong to an individual, but that is owned by the whole community, the whole village, and all villagers are entitled to graze their sheep upon it. So, and then is the point, or the thought Hardin has is now the following. Well, for every single villager, it is very rational to send many of his own sheep on the meadow, on the common land, because he doesn't have to pay anything for it, so they can use the common land. But then in consequence, there might be soon too many sheep on the common land. The pasture becomes overused, and at a certain point, the pasture might even suffer something like an ecological breakdown. So all villages, in a way, have competing interests here, two competing interests. On the one hand, as members of the village, they have an interest in preventing overuse. They have an interest in continuing to use the meadow for a long time, and therefore in preventing overuse. On the other side, they, as a private person, have an interest in grazing as many sheep as possible on this meadow. And so there is a conflict of rationality here, and after all, we can see what might be a good conclusion in this scenario, namely that the numbers of sheep need to be reduced. This obviously has to be done. And then if all have at the same time an interest in grazing their sheep there, the solution can only be a fair deal, namely a deal where everyone reduces their sheep up to a certain point so that all can have some sheep there, but at the same time that the pasture does not become overused. And you probably see already that there are many connections to the climate crisis discussion, because many people say, well, this exactly the tragedy of the commons depicts the problem we have when we are facing the climate crisis. Namely, we have something like a common good, the atmosphere. For the atmosphere, it is no problem if a couple of persons would emit only a bit. This would be very fine. But the problem is if many people are emitting, producing emissions, then we get a problem that somehow adds up. And so the only solution, the only way out is somehow to find a fair global deal to deal with this problem and to somehow reduce emissions for everyone. So, and what I would like you to do now in groups, and we can, I just present the scenario and then we can see how we organize the groups, is to discuss a possible solution in a concrete scenario. And this is the scenario I've designed for you. Imagine that we have a village of 4 villages to keep things pretty easy. And they have 100 sheep upon the common land, in total 100 sheep. If you look at the second column, in the first column, you have the villages A, B, C, D, and in the second column, you have the numbers of sheep they currently have upon the common land, and this adds up to 100. So, they all agree, the villages, that they have to remove sheep, that only half of the numbers of sheep, namely 50, should be left on the meadow, on the common land, because otherwise the common land is overused and it won't be good for the common land. And they all have a shared interest in protecting the common land. So they agree we have to remove 50 sheep. And now the question is, who has to remove how many sheep? In the end, the number of sheep currently upon the common land must be down by 50, but who has to reduce up to which number? That is the question I would like to ask you to work on and to solve, to discuss in a group. And I provide you some more information, namely, in the third column, the total amount of sheep on the common land. So for each villager, I listed here how many sheep have they had on the land in the past, taken together with the sheep they have currently on the common land. And to give the whole thing a bit more economic reality, I mentioned as well in the last and final column how many money the different villages possess. Why is this important? Well, if they don't continue in grazing their sheep, they need to find some other business to gain some money, so they need to undergo an economic transformation, and they of course need money for this transformation. So roughly, to make things easy, I said here, well, each villager needs $100 to replace one sheep by some other economic business that creates the same income. So this is an important question as well, paying for the transformation. So this is the scenario, and I would now like to ask you to work in groups. I think 3 up to 4 people would be nice. We can make breakout rooms for the online groups, and if you are in Goslar, you can somehow organize there how to work in groups. And yeah, I would like to discuss, ask you to discuss in groups, how would you solve this problem? What would you consider to be a just solution? How these 4 villages can reduce their sheep from 100 up to down to 50 sheep. Maybe I should first ask whether the scenario is clear, or whether there are some further problems in understanding the scenario and what you have to do. And then maybe Benjamin can help me in organizing how we make the breakout rooms and the groups. Yeah.
Yes, we're happy to help, but I think we'll conclude the second lecture part now and cut the recording, and then we do the question part. I guess we're going to do a short wrap up before you finally leave, so I'm not going to say thank you yet, but rather do this at the end. So